Every once in a while, Wizards will print cards with effects that instantly win you the game. These cards garner a lot of attention and people pretty much always try and find a way to make them work. So today we're going to go over some of the best alternative win conditions that exist in the game. And at number 10, we have Hellkite Tyrant. This is a 6/5 dragon with a mana cost of 4 and 2 red. It has flying and trample, meaning it can only be blocked by creatures with flying and reach, and deals excess combat damage to the defending player when attacking. It has the abilities where, when it deals combat damage to a player, you gain control of all artifacts that player controls. It also has an ability where at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. Hellkite Tyrant is a very situational card. Stealing your opponent's artifacts doesn't do anything if your opponent doesn't have any artifacts, and getting 20 artifacts is a very tall order. This is why Hellkite Tyrant really hasn't seen any competitive play. It does, however, have a niche in Commander, particularly with Scion of the Dragon. Scion is a 4/4 dragon with flying that costs 1 of each of the 5 colors to cast and has the ability where you can pay 2 to search your library for a dragon card and put it into your graveyard. And then Scion becomes a copy of that card until the end of the turn. With Scion as your commander, you can transform him into a Hellkite Tyrant against an opponent who has a particularly strong artifact you want to steal. Normally, I wouldn't consider Commander too much when making these lists, but alternative win conditions are actually weak enough that this is more impressive than what a lot of the other cards can do. So despite being kinda weak, Hellkite Tyrant sneaks its way onto our list. And at number 9, we have Felidar Sovereign. This is a 4/6 cat beast with a mana cost of 4 and 2 white. It has vigilance and lifelink, meaning it doesn't have to tap to attack, and whenever it deals damage you gain that much life. It also has the ability where at the beginning of your upkeep you win the game if you have 40 or more life. In most formats, getting to 40 life is very difficult. However, in Commander, players start with 40 life, making Sovereign's condition trivial. You can't quite count on not losing any life before playing Sovereign, so it's typically played in life gain focused decks, or at least decks capable of gaining life. Decks like Oloro are really good at keeping their life totals over 40, so Felidar Sovereign is a really easy win condition for them. However, it is quite a bit slower than other win conditions in the format, so it doesn't come anywhere close to CEDH, which is why Felidar Sovereign is a relatively low spot on this list. And at number 8, we have Maze's End. This is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and can be tapped to add 1 colorless mana. It also has the ability where you can pay 3, tap Maze's End, and return it to your hand to search your deck for a gate card and put it onto the battlefield. And then if you control 10 or more gates with different names, you win the game. Gates are a land type, so Maze's End's activated ability is just color fixing until you meet its requirements. Maze's End is a crowd favorite in Commander, where finding 10 different named lands isn't as big of a task. The card is also better than you'd think in competitive formats, like Explorer or Historic. There are lots of cards that synergize with gates, and a lot of these cards are actually pretty good. And if you're playing a bunch of gates so that your gate cards work, why not throw in Maze's End to make your deck better against control? Now, while these decks do exist, they aren't particularly good. The main problem is that most of the guild gates enter the battlefield tap, making the deck very slow and easy to run over with aggro. In a format as powerful as Explorer or Historic, playing a deck full of tap lands is just too high of an ask, even for a land that can just win you the game. And at number 7, we have Liliana's Contract. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 2 black, and the abilities where when it enters the battlefield, you draw 4 cards and lose 4 life. It also has the ability where at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 4 demons with different names, you win the game. Contract's enter the battlefield trigger is really strong, even if 4 life is a lot. Winning the game with a trigger may seem like a long shot, but there are ways to make this easier. There's a card called Arcane Adaptation, which is an enchantment that costs 2 and 1 blue that lets you choose a creature type and makes all your creatures everywhere gain that creature type. This means that the contract can win you the game off of having any 4 creatures with different names. This is a lot easier than getting out 4 demons, which are typically quite expensive to cast. However, it's still slow enough and easy enough to interact with that it wasn't really a big threat, even in Standard, the weakest constructed format. The card is very strong on its own right, and is even better with blink shenanigans. But 5 mana is steep enough that players would rather just play cheaper and more consistent draw effects in black instead. Contract is a potentially strong card that's just a bit too unwieldy to see play. And at number 6, we have Faithbound Judge. This is a 4/4 Spirit Soldier with a mana cost of 1 and 2 white that has Defender, meaning it can't attack, flying, and vigilance. It has the abilities where at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a judgment counter on it if it has less than 3 judgment counters on it, and once it has 3 judgment counters, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. It also has Disturb for 5 and 2 white, which means you can cast Transformed from your graveyard for its Disturb costs, which means it will enter the battlefield as Sinner's Judgment, an Aura Curse with Enchant Player, and the abilities where during your upkeep you put a judgment counter on it, and when it has 3 or more judgment counters on it, the enchanted player loses the game. Judgment also has the ability where if it would be put into your graveyard, you exile it instead. Judge is a card that performs well in slower decks. It does a great job at gumming up the board and blocking your opponent's creatures, as a 4/4 with flying is a great blocker. It also forces your opponent to remove it, as a 4/4 with flying and vigilance is also a great attacker, even if it takes a while to get the ball rolling. Once your opponent kills the Judge, Sinner's Judgment is a really scary card to have attached to you. Your opponent not needing to attack you at all to win can be really hard to play around. Now, Judge is a pretty alright card, but it doesn't really see any play, mostly because there are just better options. Playing a 4/4 blocker for 3 isn't as good in control decks as just playing a board wipe on turn 4, and you never want to kill your own creatures with your board wipes. And while it is an okay finisher, it's slow enough that there are just better finishers. Paying 7 mana on your own turn to do something that doesn't really impact the board, even in control decks where you can force your opponent to be top decking and kill other creatures, is scary enough that decks would like to avoid it. There are also much better control finishers such as Hullbreaker Horror, which notably has flash, meaning you can cast at the end of your opponent's turn to keep your mana open on your opponent's turn. So in the end, there's no reason to play Faithbound Judge over other cards. And at number 5, we have Triskaidekaphobia. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 1 black, and the ability where at the beginning of your upkeep you choose one. Either player with exactly 13 life loses the game, then each player gains 1 life, or each player with exactly 13 life loses the game, then each player loses 1 life. Triskaidekaphobia is a very weird card that would generally be very hard to set up, as getting your opponent to exactly 13 life is difficult when your opponent can block your creatures and gain or lose life with their own cards. However, there's a card called Tree of Perdition, a 0/13 plant with a mana cost of 3 and 1 black, defender, and the ability, where you can tap it to exchange its toughness with your opponent's life total. This was by far the easiest way to put your opponent at exactly 13 life. These cards came out in back-to-back sets, so players went to build decks and standard with them immediately, and it was pretty bad. It was a deck that you'd run into, but it was slow, clunky, and relied on 2 cards that were just awful on their own. Now, we've been talking about cards that were bad and didn't really see any play, which kinda shows how bad alternate win conditions usually are. Wizards usually makes these cards bad on purpose, as they can easily be very unhealthy if they're too good. However, from here on out, we're talking about cards that have actually seen some competitive play. And at number 4, we have Nicol Bolas, Dragon God. This is a planeswalker with a mana cost of 1 blue, 3 black, and 1 red, and a starting loyalty of 4 with the ability where Nicol Bolas gains all loyalty abilities of all other planeswalkers on the battlefield. You can +1 him to draw a card and make each opponent exile a card in their hand or a permanent they control. You can -3 him to destroy a creature or planeswalker, and you can -8 him to make each of your opponent who doesn't control a legendary creature or planeswalker lose the game. The condition for Bolas's instant win effect is the easiest to fulfill we've seen so far. However, the ultimates of planeswalkers are usually too slow to really matter, as Bolas is no exception. It's a nice ability to have, but the main attraction are the 2 other abilities. Both of the other abilities are pretty good and better than most other planeswalkers at this mana cost. The +1 is a +2 win card advantage, and being able to kill a planeswalker on his -3 is something that most planeswalkers can't do. The ability to gain all abilities of other planeswalkers is very situational, but it does open up some lines of play you wouldn't otherwise have. However, even with all of this going for him, Nicol Bolas has only ever seen sparing play. The biggest reason for this is that his mana cost is very restrictive, making him a pretty clunky card to play. Still, Bolas has seen plays in formats like Pioneer as a value engine and possible win condition for Grixis control decks. And at number 3, we have Vraska, Golgari Queen. This is a planeswalker with a starting loyalty of 4 and a mana cost of 2, 1 black, and 1 green. She has the abilities where when you +2 her, you may sacrifice another permanent, and if you do, draw a card and gain 1 life. You can -3 her to blow up a non-land permanent that costs 3 or less, and you can -9 to get an emblem with, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. Vraska is another planeswalker whose ultimate can just win you the game. But this is one of the more extra upsides rather than the main attraction of the card. The other 2 abilities are good enough to make Vraska worth playing. The +2 is really nice with cards with death triggers, letting you basically go +1 off of sacrificing a creature. Being a +2 rather than a +1 is also really good, as it lets Vraska gain loyalty more quickly. The -3 is a really solid removal option as well. Vraska saw play in a bunch of different black-green mid-range decks during her time at Standard, and has seen some play in similar decks in Pioneer since. And at number 2, we have Approach of the Second Sun. This is a sorcerer with a mana cost of 6 and 1 white, and the effect where if you cast Approach from your hand and you've cast another spell with the same name this game, you win the game. Otherwise, you simply gain 7 life and then put Approach into your library 7th from the top. Approach is a bit slow, but it's actually a very consistent win condition for control decks and some combo decks and formats like Pioneer. During its time in Standard, Approach was used as the win condition for white control decks, who were really good at stalling and drawing cards to be able to win off of approach. The 7 life was relevant more than you'd think, making it harder for your opponent to burst you down before you have time to cast your approach again. Of course, all of this got even better if you had multiple copies of approach in your hand. In Pioneer, approach is sometimes used as the win condition for hidden strings combo decks. This deck combines cards that can untap cards alongside Lotus Field, a land that forces you to sacrifice 2 lands when you play it, but taps for 3 mana of any one color. Using multiple cards like this, the deck can generate a ton of mana, which they use to play a ton of draw spells to put together a combo. Approach is simply the most convenient and simple to use win condition for these decks, and the deck can pretty easily make the mana and draw through enough cards to cast Approach twice on a single turn. Approach is a surprisingly easy to pull off win condition, but it pales in comparison to the number 1 spot on this list. And at number 1, we have Thassa's Oracle. This is a 1/3 Merfolk wizard with a mana cost of 2 blue. It has the ability where when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of blue mana symbols and the mana cost of all your permanents. You put up to 1 of them on top of your library, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any random order. Then if X was greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game. Before we go on, we should mention Laboratory Maniac and Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, which are both cards that can win you the game if you have an empty deck, and both have seen play in similar decks as Thassa's Oracle, but Oracle is the best due to being the cheapest to cast. There are way more ways to win off of Oracle than you'd think. For example, Doomsday is a card that lets you search your library and graveyard for 5 cards, exile all the rest, and then put those cards you choose on top of your deck in any order, and you lose half your life rounded up. In formats like Vintage and Legacy, Doomsday decks can win from a bunch of different board states by drawing through the last 5 cards of the deck and playing an Oracle. Another card that's been used to instantly win games with Oracle is Demonic Consultation. This is an instant for 1 black mana that allows you to choose a card name, then you exile the top 6 cards of your deck. You reveal cards at the top of your deck until you reveal a card of the chosen name, put that card into your hand and exile the rest. However, if you name a card that isn't in your deck, you'll simply exile your entire library. This means you can exile your entire deck for 1 mana and win the game off of your Oracle. These are just 2 of the ways to get rid of your entire deck and win with Thassa's Oracle. This is so strong that combo decks using Oracle have been a big part of both the Legacy and Vintage metagame, and the card sees play in combo decks in Pioneer and Modern from time to time. Not a single other alternative win condition has seen anywhere near as much play as Oracle, so it easily takes the top spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Do you think there are any other cards that we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments.